whether you have roots in New York City or whether you come into New York City by choice. It's a place that's a beacon. It's a place where you challenge yourself. It's a place of so much culture that you're drawn to it.
New York will come back, be built a little bit like the Phoenix. It'll rise from its ashes. Mm-hmm. And it'll give New York a certain chance to I won't say start over, but to recreate itself as an even better place.
I love that. I say that a lot, and you sometimes get looks from people, but I have to believe that that's what's going to happen, that New York will become something else.
When Citizens was founded, New York City was mired in one of the worst financial crises in its history. And that now famous advertisement that our founder, Oz Elliott, placed in the New York Times produced over 10,000 caring neighbors. Everyone pitched in as city services were slashed, and that's the proud beginning of this organization.
Today, we're in the midst of crisis, and we need to step up. And we've seen it before, that when average, everyday New Yorkers come together, they can make amazing things happen. They can create places that have been left behind. They can bring them forward.
40 years ago, New York City was on the verge of bankruptcy. The New York Times, writing about that period not long ago, said that the difference between solvency and insolvency was paper thin. New York is very different today, arguably the most diverse and interesting city in the world. We don't claim credit for that transformation, but we do proudly claim credit for being there in 1975 when things were so difficult for the city.
New Yorkers are the toughest people in the world. So when I hear folks say that New York is dead, New York is over, cities persist, and New York is the greatest city in the world. So that is not the truth.
New York City is said to be a metropolis, forever chasing progress and perfection, but it is lately best at making do with the reality of considerably less.
All In for New York City says it all. We are going to do everything that we can to make sure that the greatest city in the world always wins and continues to win, and that everybody gets to celebrate in that victory. Good afternoon. So glad to be here with you, and so glad that you're here to join me and my keyboard for our next CitizensNYC Live Rethink and Rebuild conversation. I'm Dr. Hassan Harris, CEO of Citizens Committee for New York City, and we are so grateful, number one, in this season of holidays, of togetherness, to try to bring a little bit of hope and sunshine. Happy Hanukkah to all folks who are celebrating. Also wanted to recognize all the other holidays that are coming up. We're going to have a conversation as it snows here in New York City that's about education and how that we take care of our family members, educate our young ones, and provide supports that make sure that our adults have the flexibility so they can go to work and provide for their families, knowing that their young ones are taken care of and being educated. So we're excited for this CitizensNYC Live Rethink and Rebuild conversation that is about hyperlocal education. This is one in a series of conversations that we've had that have spanned from talking about small businesses and how they are faring during this pandemic. We've talked about civic engagement and voting and the census, police community relations, and we are making sure that we're touching on topics that really matter for New Yorkers. And I think as New York goes, it's a big example for what's happening across the country and even an example for the world. So we're excited. Citizens Committee, for those who do not know, was founded in 1975 in crisis when New York City was trying to come out of a budget problem, and also a problem where folks felt that New York City was a difficult place to live. And a bunch of average, everyday New Yorkers stepped up and said, New York is our city. We're going to roll up our sleeves and take control of our own destiny by working together. And they picked up brooms, signed petitions, advocated for their neighborhood so that they can be in a better place. And this conversation is in that spirit. So we're really excited to have Dr. Randall Pinkett. We're going to have a conversation first and foremost about some data and resources and mapping resources to figure out what we can do and how we can come together. And that will be followed by a conversation that I have with two other specialists, Dr. Rebecca Garte and Josh Elder, to talk about hyperlocal education. So Dr. Pinkett, so great to see you. Really glad that you're joining us. I hope that folks aren't zoomed out and that folks are doing well and can really get into this conversation. So just really briefly, would love for you to introduce who you are and who are BCT partners, and how are you coming to this conversation with Citizens Committee?
Well, thank you, Rasan, for having me on the program today, and thank you for your leadership at Citizens NYC, particularly in this moment in 2020, where there is so much happening in our communities, and the need for leadership has never been greater. I just want to commend you for the leadership you've offered as a relatively new arrival to Citizens NYC at exactly the moment when you were needed most. So again, I commend you, my friend. By way of introduction, I am one of the managing partners at BCT Partners. We're celebrating 20 years at BCT with a mission to provide insights about diverse people that lead to equity. And so equity is our end game. Equity for communities, equity for diverse populations, equity when we think about all of what contributes to the well-being of communities, and how we can bring some powerful insights to illuminate opportunities in an increasingly diverse society. And we do that through a number of means: traditional capacity building and organizational development, but also, as you mentioned, through research, data, analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the list goes on. We're happy to partner with Citizens NYC in how we can leverage some of those tools to illuminate opportunities for equity here in 2020.
So really briefly, we've partnered with BCT Partners because, for those who don't know, Citizens Committee, Citizens NYC, has made thousands of grants to local level leaders across the 5 boroughs. And we recognize that we had information on folks who are motivated to help and problem solve in this moment where there's so many problems to address. We know that you have a database that you have access to, and your technology is rather incredible. And we also have other partners that we'll talk a little bit more about later that, at least from a conceptual level, if we can match where our leaders are and folks who we're connected to other resources that are out there, then we will be able to hopefully catalyze activity, organizing, and folks coming together. So can you talk a little bit about your tool for BCT Partners and how you're interacting with us specifically around this issue of kind of asset mapping and finding the lay of the land of where people are?
Absolutely. I'll try to be as efficient as I can. So hopefully folks can see my screen, which shows the actual tool. BCT has built out what we call the Equitable Impact Platform. We call it EQUIP, EQUIP, for Equitable Impact Platform. And we've combined a number of data sets, among them the Census Bureau's American Community Survey data, which allows us to measure community well-being. But we've also brought in the IRS 990 filings for all nonprofits, charitable organizations, which allows us to capture the dollar flows, the programmatic investments in those communities. And we've used machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence to then map Are the investments being made sufficient to improve the conditions within communities? And there's a number of use cases we can implement with this platform. Among them is what we're doing with Citizens NYC, which is what you see here. We have data from Citizens NYC on your grantees, as you know, Rasan, Dr. Harris. We've also laid on top of that our information around the nonprofits that are also serving the different boroughs throughout New York. And then we've also gotten from you data from City University of New York around teachers enrolled in education programs who could be deployed to organizations that are looking for teachers as a way of getting the resources to the right people and in the right place. So if I just zoom in into the Bronx, what you see is a map of organizations serving the Bronx, both from Citizens NYC grantees, but also from the 990 filings. And if I roll over one of these organizations, it's going, let me go over a Citizens grantee, which is in the red. It'll pull up the community well-being for that area, which is a measure of how well that community is doing. But also, if you can look a little deeper, you see how many teachers in different programs, ECE for early childhood education, EDB for bilingual education, EDU for childhood education, are within proximity to that organization. And if I go even deeper, I'm almost done here, Rasan. If I go even deeper, I can zoom in and only on that organization. But what's super cool is I can actually pull up the street level view of that community. And the last thing I'll show is that's
fantastic.
And the last thing I'll show is we also then have this inventory of all of those organizations, both citizens, grantees, and other nonprofits serving that region. We have information about their mission, their location, their revenue, their program output, the population they serve, the persons of color in need, and we've layered on COVID-19 data as well. You can imagine the various use cases that this could engender, but I'll send it back to you, Rasan, to see if there's more you want to say.
No, so I think that is incredible. So, as a layperson, if I want to figure out who's in my community, I have a family. My child is in school. Schools are on and off. I might have to, I'm an essential worker and I have to work a 9 to 5 and I have to figure out how to get my child educated, how to make sure that they're engaged a full day. Being able to identify organizations that are in the community that might have resources to investigate, figuring out leaders that are mobilized that are also could be people who can collaborate to figure out how to take the primary focus of some of these organizations pre-COVID, but figure out how to innovate in this moment of COVID and beyond to meet the needs of what's happening. I think it's extremely powerful. So laying data from different groups, and in this example, Citizens Committee data that's available from the nonprofit filings and what the government can tell us where nonprofits are distributed, and data on resources like where teachers in training might be, for example. Mm-hmm. Extremely powerful to figure out how folks can organize, mobilize, collaborate, and try to create new solutions. And so I'm struck by the fact that that BCT Partners had the foresight and the vision of thinking that data could be useful and potentially actionable. And I just wanted to know, why did you get interested in data in the first place, and looking at resource allocation within communities? What motivated you to do that, and what do you think is the power of that?
No, great commentary, Rasan. And my background has historically been in computer engineering, information technology, and more recently data science. But like you, wanted to leverage the gifts that I've been given for social good. And I've married a career that has combined kind of technology and data, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and community building. And my doctoral dissertation at MIT looked at the role of technology in low-income communities, but the subtitle of my dissertation was an asset-based approach to community technology and community building. Keywords, asset-based. So to your question around resource allocation, what's interesting is part of the puzzle of recovery from COVID is essentially a resource optimization problem. And I'm sounding a bit technical now, but we think about the fact that businesses are closed or at lower capacity. Childcare facilities are closed or at lower capacity. Schools are navigating whether to be open or to be virtual. Teachers and other resources are having to rethink. This is back to our theme of our webinar, having to rethink how do we rebuild and who belongs where and when and what do they bring and what's needed and how do we figure all that out? Well, the beauty is data, especially geospatial data, vis-a-vis the equitable impact platform we're partnered on, gives us the ability to run all these scenarios. Where are the COVID cases? Where are the teachers? Where are the educational resources? Where are those that we know are in need based on what the data tells us according to their socioeconomic status? And how do we prioritize those who need resources the most? So when we strategize, we're not making guesses, we're being strategic and data-driven and evidence-based.
It's really incredible. You have formal entities, you have nonprofit organizations, you have the government that tracks where people are located and keeps data, but then you have informal resources, the abuela that's on the block that takes care of tons of kids, or you might have some, a single mom that provides guidance and mentorship for many folks that are out there. You might have some young men, and I'm not trying to create stereotypes, but young men that might be underemployed or out of work, but around, but can be a resource. And understanding where resources that are formal resources are, I think can be interesting to release to community members so that they can utilize their assets and who they are and where they are to mobilize to find solutions. And from my experience, I found coordination is usually the biggest problem. You'll have resources that are stockpiled in one area and complete lack of resources in the other. And the only thing that keeps those resources to getting to where they need to be is lack of information, lack of communication, and lack of coordination. And I believe it starts with first laying it out and then hopefully catalyzing conversations that can make a change.
No, you're absolutely spot on. I think of the word arbitrage. You've got opportunities or needs that are shifting as we speak. We have a new normal, and recovery is going to create successively new normals as we get back to what may not actually be the normal we once knew. But in that conversation, and I give credit to our chief data scientist, Pete York, for really pioneering these ideas, is how do we layer an asset-based frame that empowers community members to be able to make informed decisions about what's best for their community. And that's both lifting up the voices to say the abuela, the local resident, the tacit knowledge, the local knowledge, combined with some powerful tools that can therefore also illuminate, well, where are other resources? And the beauty of the 990 data is that it gives us the ability to know, and it gets back to your point, not just what resources have typically flowed into the communities, but we've been able to analyze, are there communities that are getting over-invested?
Yeah.
There's too many resources going to those communities, and there's not enough going to these. So if we begin with an asset-based frame that guides where should the resources be invested, and not kind of backing out of saying, well, what's the status quo of why that community gets millions of dollars and that community gets hundreds of dollars? No. Let's begin with where are the assets, where are the needs, and how do we align investment to move the needle to optimize those resources? And that's what these tools give us the ability to do.
That's a fantastic frame. And, it's interesting because you think about inequity and disparity. And so things aren't equitable, things aren't even, but it's also, as you were speaking, made me think about sustainability. To make full cities work, to make a country work, you can't have a lot in one space and nothing in another, because ultimately we're all connected, whether we realize it or not. And
That's
so
right.
when you have disparities, when you have imbalance that is like just enormous,
Mhm.
it threatens our ability to sustain our way of life, sustain our prosperity, to sustain what we're doing as a neighborhood, as a city, as states, or as a country. And I think using data allows us to understand where the problems might be and hopefully go to solutions. So I want to end, because I know you have to go soon, and we're going to get to our other panelists. You're a brilliant mind, a Rhodes Scholar. You won a contest on television. Entrepreneurially, you could do whatever you wanted to do, but you've dedicated your entrepreneurship and your technology skills in this space. If you could tell very specifically, why did you choose this path versus one in which you could have made great wealth for yourself and just doing for yourself? Why did you dedicate yourself in this space that some folks would not necessarily see as an asset, as we've been talking about a lot, but some folks have actually denigrated and said that there's not a lot of value there?
Yeah, no, great final question. And some of my business partners personally, Dr. Harris, we sat around a cafeteria table at Rutgers University and believed that we could use our talents to make a difference. And we've always identified and in some ways prided ourselves as being social entrepreneurs, focused on that double bottom line, making a dollar and making a difference, getting a financial return on investment, but equally importantly, a social return on investment. And BCT has been an experiment for us over the past 20 years of what can be, quite honestly, competing demands. When you think about how do you run a business that has a social agenda, and how do you prioritize and create a business model that can accomplish both? I think we've actually found ourselves at a very solid place of being very mission driven, but also very successful in what we do. And that our mission of providing insights about diverse people that lead to equity has never been more aligned. And in 2020 has never been more timely.
Wow. Well, Randall, Dr. Pinkett, and yes, we're leaning hard into the doctors today.
That's right. Call me Dr. Biden. Call me Dr. Biden.
No, I really appreciate your partnership. I appreciate your commitment, your passion, and being living proof that you can live with purpose and still do well. And so thank you for just being a partner in all this work.
Thank you again for the invitation, Rasan. Thank you again for your leadership. And I look forward to the continuation of this conversation.
Excellent. So as we move into the panel, we have two guests that will allow us to take what we were talking about from a maybe 50,000 foot level. Yes, we told you data is out there and we're doing resource allocation analysis. We're going to really try to make it more granular and grounded in education. I'll tell a quick story and then I'll introduce our guest. So I'm a parent. I'm a parent of a 6-year-old. She goes to a public school and she's in 1st grade. And as the pandemic hit, my family had a decision to make. Would we send our daughter to in-person school? That in-person school isn't 5 days a week. It is 3 days on, 3 days off, 2 days on, 2 days off, a hybrid model. Or would we do full remote? We know that our daughter, as an only child, really benefited from social interactions. So we were really tempted to send her into school, but we also had concerns of the instability of the moment of the pandemic, getting into a schedule, potentially having to shut down, and then figuring out how we would rearrange our schedule in a moment's notice to take care and educate our daughter, but also take care of our other responsibilities. So we created a third way, and it was creating an education pod. My family's blessed to be able to have some resources to pay for an instructor that help guide my daughter and a couple of her colleagues, classmates, through the curriculum that was provided by and is provided by the Department of Education. So she's doing what they're giving from school, but they're doing it as a group in the homes of the families that are participating. So that in definition is a pod. A pod in some ways has been given a little bit of a description of being something for the privileged, because having the privilege to be able to pay in addition to what you would do normally to send a child to school, to public school, is something that only a few folks can do. But podding, creating clusters, groups of folks that take care of each other, particularly when you can barter services or take advantage of resources like nonprofits, folks that might be underemployed, finding ways to stay safe, having socially distanced practices, wearing masks when you need to, and using hand sanitizer. There's an opportunity for folks to create pods within their communities to, take care of their childcare and education challenges. And so that led us to a conversation of what would it look like if we mapped out community resources and figured out what was possible to create pods that aren't necessarily just for folks that can pay for them, but for folks that can utilize community resources that are out there, and also for folks who can barter their services and come together to take care of one another. And one of the things that's intriguing is this can be a solution that's not just for a time of the pandemic, because there's education disparities and education issues that have been long a part of the city and the education life of many neighborhoods. And then there's also a childcare problem that many folks the challenge that they have. So we're excited to have an educator from CUNY, Dr. Rebecca Garte, and she can let me know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. And we have Josh Elder, who is from the Siegel Family Endowment. They're going to talk about how they're entering into this conversation and some ideas they have, and even some specific projects that address this. So first, I wanted to welcome you both. Thank you so much for being here. Rebecca, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself and say how you're entering this conversation.
Hi, I am a teacher education professor. I'm also a person who's been involved with New York City public schools as a community member and advocate. I also have my degree is in psychology, so I'm in lots of different aspects that relate to education. I read an article about some connection between a few school districts and some higher education institutions in the city that had partnered to have student teachers match up with local families and schools. And I noticed that both the higher education institutions, the neighborhoods, and the schools were located in what's kind of known to be highly affluent areas, serving highly affluent populations. So even before that, I had some ideas about how to do something with our students who I serve, who are at a community college. They are almost entirely the first people in their families to get to go to college. They are over 90% qualified for financial aid based on being below the federal poverty line, and they are over 90% people of color and Black students. So those students they all come from all over the city to a college that's located in Tribeca, but they live very far flung. And I know where they live because we know their addresses and we place them in schools. And so even before this article, I wondered about what was happening where they lived, knowing that our public school students are also spread very far out in the city. And after reading that article and having those thoughts, I also, thought about Citizens Committee of New York City, because I have personally written 3 grants for Citizens Committee as a small, in my community advocacy world, and gotten 2 of them, or helped get 2 of them. So I knew that Citizens Committee had an amazing database of very local organizations that are spread throughout all of these different neighborhoods. And, started talking to Rasan, and here we are.
Awesome. No, thank you for that introduction. Joshua, can you introduce yourself and how you're entering into this conversation?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's definitely a privilege to be amongst such a distinguished panel of doctors. Just to reinforce that concept, definitely enjoying this opportunity. But my name is Joshua Elder. I'm the Director of Grants Management at Siegel Family Endowment. We're located here in New York City. And so we are a foundation that's focused on kind of understanding the impact and shaping the impact of technology on society. Before I moved into the philanthropic space, I was an educator. So started off as a middle school educator teaching science in Virginia.
God bless you. Middle schoolers, my Lord.
I absolutely, 8th graders are my favorite. 7th graders, it's a struggle, but 8th graders, absolutely all day, every day. But no, loved what I was doing. Only wanted to be in areas that were under-resourced, underprivileged. Most people did not want to teach in those areas. So both in Richmond, Virginia, and inner city Philadelphia in the charter world, and then moved halfway across the world to go into South Africa and work with the underprivileged populations, under-resourced populations in the townships in Cape Town and even in Kenya. And so for me, this conversation is so important. I think as you led with thinking about, especially for us as an organization, as we started evaluating and understanding what's the impact of the pandemic, especially around learning, both the short term, medium term, and the long term, this idea of podding started to surface. And the fact that it was something that was only thought about to be an option or accessible to those that had wealth or an abundant resources. And we started thinking about A, how can we debunk that notion? And B, how can we create or find innovative models that actually are going to provide what's needed for students that need these resources the most? And so really excited that we came across an opportunity, and I can talk more about this later, to really fund a pilot with a school leader that's been in our ecosystem for quite some time in the New York City public schools to think about how we create accessible opportunities for learning pods for students here in New York City, and then understand what we can learn from that to be able to spread that and make it accessible for others as we are really entering this unknown period of what the rest of the school year is going to look like, and dare say, even reimagine how this could stick when we do return to whatever the new normal looks like. Doesn't mean that this needs to go away as soon as we return back to what may be a fully in-person education model. So really excited to be here to talk more and to think about potential partnerships to create more opportunities for students and families that need it the most here in the city.
Great. So since you have the mic, Joshua, I'll let you go on this basic term. We said pod. What does pod mean to you in the most positive sense? And then also, what are the potential things that have made pod a bad word to certain people? Like, what do you think are some of the things that people attach to pods that you think might get in the way of it being more accessible to most?
Yeah. I think for me, like before I even associated the term pod with learning, I think I immediately think about it from like a biological standpoint, right? Like I forget, and I wasn't a biology teacher, so forgive me any biology educators out there. I was more on the chemistry and the physics side of things. But if you think about, I don't know, a pod of whales, let's say, if that's the correct terminology, but just being together and being in a group and having kind of that interaction, that physical interaction, coming and going together, but having a home base and being able to unite and just kind of take on whatever that they are going to face. And so it was really interesting. We had a conversation a few days ago with a few other funders, both in New York City and across the US. And it was a really interesting conversation. And one of the biggest questions that came about was, what do we actually mean by pod? Are we just referencing what we would normally call small group instruction if we were in school and in-person school environment, or is there something different? And I think for us in this pilot that we are doing, one of the things that is central and core and why this need developed was realizing, there was a set of students that their home environment just isn't the best place for them to learn. There's so many other obstacles. Maybe there's no one there to help them. Parents have 3 or 4 other school-age children, are just trying to stay alive. I mean, let's be real, in this pandemic, like the struggle has been real just to meet ends meet and make sure that everyone is healthy and just kind of getting by day. And so some of those students just needed to get out of the home environment and come into a space where someone could actually be there to supervise them, attend to the kind of social emotional aspects that's really hard to get a handle on as a teacher when you're teaching virtually, and just have interaction with their peers. And so for us, that's how we've defined it, is that the fact that we're creating these environments for students to come together, have their peer interaction, have interactions with others that care and support them, but they're still also getting interactions with their teachers virtually. So it's not replacing what's happening virtually, it's to enhance it. And I think your question about the negative connotation is that we were hesitant to even raise this question, because probably a few months ago, if you said learning pods, everyone would like give you a really kind of weird reaction. They'd wrinkle their nose up, because everyone, I think, had this negative association that we're only talking about something that's accessible for the elite. And so we were only hearing stories about, in the Hamptons, they're creating learning pods for their students, or other places. And no one thought about or even questioned, well, wait a minute, everyone, no matter what, wants to do what's best for their child or for their student, regardless of the access to wealth that they have. So why can't we question, why is this something that's only available to a certain subset of people? And so it is nice to now start pushing and challenging that assumption to say, actually, like, let's break that negative connotation, and let's actually make it something that can be accessible. And it's not this dirty word that we don't want to say, or we whisper it because we're afraid what might happen if we kind of go that direction and explore it.
Thank you for that. I'm going to toss it to you, Rebecca, on defining a pod, but I really wanted to bring out one of the myths potentially of podding, or one of the dangers of not leaning into how to make remote learning more successful and impactful. Because the New York Times a week ago had a headline, 12,000 more white children returned to NYC schools than Black children. And so when you think about privilege and you think about decisions folks are making, for me, that's mind-blowing, because as a public school parent, I know that the majority of public school students in New York City are Black and brown. And so when you have a situation where you have to make a decision if you're going to go in person by mid-November, and then when people make that decision that it's primarily, more white students going back than Black students, it lets you know that there's something that has to be in community, in place, in people's homes, closer than just the school sometimes, in order to make sure that folks are getting educated. And so it's interesting as you think about disparity or podding being for privilege. There's a remote learning thing that's happening in community colors that's real. And I think if it's going to be effective to make sure there's not a huge learning gap, that we got to figure out a way to educate folks in a way they feel that they're physically going to keep their children safe. But then you're also making sure that they're learning, and that you're also taking care of the childcare needs that, families have, because we also know disproportionately essential workers are, folks from Black and brown communities. So you also have a real need where folks aren't necessarily just zooming into work. But Rebecca, doctor, could you please speak to what your definition of podding is? And you can even go into the next part of the question, which is, what are some of your ideas, if you had a magic wand, or some things you'd like to do with some of the teachers that you were training in regards to some of your ideas for podding? Again, no commitments. You're not making any commitments.
Okay.
What would it look like?
Sure. Yeah, I do want to maybe very briefly address a little bit of, the extreme sort of racial and socioeconomic disparities in terms of who's going into school and who is fully remote. Number one, I just think that the hybrid schedule requires a higher level of resources. I think going in and out and back and forth and having different days requires people to have very flexible schedules, very flexible childcare that they're paying for. It's just not accessible to a lot of people. The other piece, unfortunately, I do think that the level of trust among the New York City public school parent population varies widely in terms of how much families really deeply trust their public schools. That varies, unfortunately, by how much social, cultural, political capital those families have. And if you have a lot of that capital, you can make sure that your children and your family are given what you want them to get. But if you don't, you're not so sure. And, I'll just give one example, not to go off, but I know from anecdotal personal teachers that I'm in touch with that there are buildings that have not had any heat, elementary public school buildings, for a week, going on a second week. And there's no transparency about that. So whether you're looking at the ventilation issues, when we looked at the reports of ventilation in buildings, there were huge problems with transparency. Nobody even knew what to make of them other than this looks really bad. Now we have other issues. There's a lot of issues in the New York City public school system in terms of who gets information when, communication, how much transparency is given towards parents, towards teachers, and a lot of that has to do with the economic resources of the parents. So I think part of it is just the basic logistics of going in and out. And another part of it is, if this is a scary situation, am I going to trust my public school to make sure my children are safe? And given the history of what I know goes on in my school, maybe not now, And so I think there is that. And I hope that that will somehow actually get addressed by the time this is over, even in a small way. Because once you kind of peel off the onion of disparities, it's not just about funding. It's not just about, extracurriculars and bells and whistles. It's also about the relationships that school personnel have with different communities in the city. And I know that sounds a little bit alarmist, but it's a real issue. And when the chancellor or the mayor sends out a survey and a small percentage fill it out, and when, students disappear and nobody can find them, what is that? What's going on there? There's a lack of trust. There's a lack of true relationship happening. And in schools, if you don't have a real strong relationship with your school personnel as a parent, as a family, then what's going on? We have to really look at that, and we have to look at the disparities there. So I would just say that that's sort of something to put a pin on for anyone who's in education, but it's important, to think about. So for the potting, I'd never heard of it before. I believe it was something I listened to at NYU Metro Center, where they were discussing inequity issues regarding potting. And somebody, and I apologize to that person because I don't remember their name and I didn't look up the citation, but somebody mentioned how the term pods had originally come about in relation to people experiencing domestic violence, and that they had been advised to list off their pod, and their pod were 2 or 3 people that they could count on and trust under any and all circumstances, so that if they had to flee, they could find those people would protect them, they would be confidential, they would be emotionally supportive and nurturing, as well as provide resources. So, make your list. And they were talking about how those people are not necessarily the same people you would go to for other kinds of things. They may not even be your family members. They may be, a neighbor, or they may be someone who doesn't live close. So, that idea of a pod, a close network of people who support one another, I think is a really helpful concept, and almost diametrically opposed to the, elitist pod of, okay, I'm going to pay someone and everyone's in it for their own benefit. And, I'm not saying that's what really happens, but that's sort of the perception of the affluent pod. So I think maybe, there's a mixture of that. People do need to have resources that they can share. People do need to be in communication. But I think this other idea of almost like not a kinship, because not really related by kin, but a close network of people who you really, really trust. So as far as our students, to go to the second piece, so our students are training to be teachers. The early childhood, I teach both the elementary and the early childhood education students. The early childhood education students do a lot of field work. In their last course, they do 90 hours of field work. And what I think my dream for our students, that it's twofold. I've been involved also for the previous 3 years on a partnership with Central Harlem School District, and starting with one school and then expanding to the district. And the whole purpose of that partnership, well, one of the purposes, was to give our students experience in a meaningful fieldwork setting where they could really, first of all, work with children who in educational settings that were similar to where they had gone to school in New York City, those who had, and also who they would most likely be teaching. But even more than that, we did a bunch of research, and we're doing some more. What I found was that students really developed professional identities, and the idea of became really connected and committed to becoming future teachers when they felt they were making a difference in their classrooms. And so my colleague and I actually did a sort of quasi non-experimental, but comparison study of the typical fieldwork placements that we traditionally sent them to, which were in Tribeca. So they were like private preschools because they were convenient, right? But they were serving, very majority white child populations and majority affluent. So when our students do their fieldwork there versus when they did them in the public schools that we were partnering with on the other side, there was a really striking difference in terms of our students' development. We focused on their professional identity, but we also found differences even in their ability to understand major concepts. So it sort of penetrated into every aspect of their development. The fact that they were in a school and a classroom community where they felt comfortable, where they felt that they belonged, but also in a place where they, felt they were making a difference. So, this is their perception. It doesn't mean they weren't making a difference in the Tribeca schools. I'm sure they were. But from their own experience and perception, they felt that more strongly in schools with more children who had less resources and who looked like them. So I think that bringing it into their own personal communities where they live and partnering with organizations that are serving that local community, it could potentially make such a big difference to our students' personal development and professional development, because our students are trying to get into that professional class to become teachers. And that's a huge shift for many of them. And many of them come in not necessarily believing that they can do that. And even when they leave, they're like on the fence. Maybe I can do it. Maybe I can't. I don't know. Let's see. And the research does unfortunately show that community college transfers into 4-year, bachelor's and master's degree granting institutions don't happen at a very high percentage. There's also a real lack of teachers of color in the New York City public schools. So trying to shift that, trying to have this, what Dr. Pinkett was talking about earlier, this asset-based approach to working with our students, instead of saying, how can you, make your mark in a private preschool, let's see, what do you already have? What do you already have going for you in your local community? Who are the people there who you can maybe even partner with? Some of the organizations that are on the map, I just want my students to get in touch with them just because it would be great for them and for that organization to sort of meet, and say, oh, this is what you're doing. Okay, this is how I can contribute and connect, so that our students don't think that I have to go to Tribeca. That's where my professional life begins and ends, is Tribeca. No, your professional life, as the panelists have all mentioned, can begin and end on your block. Not end, but it can begin and grow on your own block.
Well, Rebecca, I love the way that you said that. Thinking that your block has value, you have value, that there's so many people who are assets in your community that can really make some fantastic things happen is really great. We asked for questions. We don't have tons of them, but I have one of the questions that I saw in the Facebook chat that I'm gonna bring up. Then I want Joshua, you to tell us specifically more about your project. So one of the questions was, how do we get boots on the ground? And that's a great question after Rebecca, you were talking, because we get boots on the ground by mobilizing in partnerships that have access to multiple people who are in place. So for example, CUNY teacher training has, hundreds of teachers in training across the city. Citizens Committee has thousands of past grantees. How do you get them the information and the access to resources so that they can decide how to enact change is really powerful. And that's the reason why I think we were so motivated to work with BCT partners to create this tool. And I think it does have applications that are beyond this specific issue, but I think it's critically important right now for all the reasons that you said. The second wave is upon us. People need to be indoors. There's going to be a lot of disruption. So how do we try to create some kind of stability? And, parts of the pods are, safe spaces. Are there nonprofit organizations that have space that's underutilized because people aren't showing up for their regular services? Are there, do people come together and talk and understand churches or small businesses that aren't being used the same way, to find ways to create, as Joshua was talking about, basically, more personalized, small classroom instruction? That's a gold standard. And I think that if we can mobilize folks with information so that they can act upon it, and so folks that might be either underemployed or figure out that they have the same issues together, and there are some resources that are within their 5-block radius, that hopefully that they can utilize that and problem solve and do some things that are extremely powerful. So Joshua, can you say a little bit more about the pilot project that you started specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely just want to echo and agree with the fact that relationships are so critical and your community and your block matter. And I think that is something that resonates with this pilot and what the school is doing in terms of how they operate in general, but especially how they are making learning pods work. So we were really fortunate to come across a school leader that had been in the NYC ecosystem, especially in the computer science for all area, and doing a lot of work around implementing technology in education. But Ben Samuels Callow is the co-founder and current principal of Creo College Prep, which is a public charter school located in the Bronx. And essentially had conversations with our executive director, Katie Knight, and just started talking about all the challenges and obstacles that they were facing in terms of making the decision, all remote, hybrid, and like what happens A day, B day, who comes, who goes, and just said, this isn't working. How can I figure out a better model to serve the students that need it the most? And so we began having conversations. And to Ben's credit, before we even provided funding for him, he was like, you know what, we're going to make this work. Whatever I need to do, I'm going to look at the budget. I'm going to crunch the numbers. We're not doing this so I can borrow money from this line item in the budget. I have to serve my students. I can't wait for the funding. So I want to give him credit for just saying he was going to figure it out before we made the decision, but it's exciting to partner. But essentially what he's done, because they are in a fully virtual learning environment, they did a needs assessment to kind of see what kids needed to come out of their home environment, as many of their students in the Bronx are in kind of multi-family, multi-generational homes that it's just impossible for one person to kind of provide and make sure high quality learning is taking place over the virtual environment. And so they ranked the students and figured out, okay, pod 1 could have this many, pod 2 could have this many, because they wanted to also make sure that they are abiding by proper CDC regulations and guidelines, as well as the DOE guidelines that have been set forth. And because their teachers were teaching virtually, he had the space, and his building isn't a DOE regulated building. So he was able to figure out, okay, if I have classrooms available, I can space them out and have pods in each of these classrooms. And then if for some reason we have to close down, he already contacted family members that would be willing to have the pods in their kind of households. I think one of the exciting pieces about this, and that what we're calling like the triple win, is that the students that need it the most are winning because they're getting this learning environment. The families that need it the most are also winning because their students that were struggling or just needed some additional assistance are getting that opportunity. And then a triple win for the community, and this kind of ties into a little bit of what Rebecca was talking about, is that the pod supervisors are not the teachers of the school. The pod supervisors are actually mostly current CUNY students that are in their own virtual kind of learning environment that have relationships with Ben and other staff members or from the community and have been volunteering. And so they're the ones that are actually serving as the supervisors. And so the fact that the teachers are still teaching remotely, the pod supervisors are the ones that are there monitoring the 10 additional students. Again, really paying attention to the SEL components that are so difficult to kind of stay in touch with and in tune with in virtual environments. And so they're there to provide support. Some of them are studying education, but others are just super passionate and interested or want to figure out how they can give back to their community, how they can give back to the students or the school. And so our hope with running this pilot that'll take us through the rest of the school year is to think about like what are the learnings and the findings that are applicable that we can share out. That this is in a charter school environment, but this isn't something that can only work in a charter school environment. We think this is something that can be replicated no matter the context, as long as you contextualize it. So we are hoping to kind of partner with people and share out what's happening along this learning journey, and then have others that want to think about like, what are the best parts of this that we can replicate and implement going forward, no matter what the future of learning looks like, as we're trying to capitalize on this moment to reimagine and rethink it.
That's amazing. It is incredible. An hour has gone past. I'm going to give you guys closing statements, but I wanted to highlight a few things. We mentioned the Metro Center at NYU. I want to give Dr. David Kirkland the shout out. I actually had an interaction with him, a conversation with him on Clubhouse, for those of you who knows what that is. And he's really excited about furthering this conversation. Joshua, to what you were saying, pilots and getting innovation that we can put out there in the community and continuing this conversation, I think is critically important, because it's not just this moment. If we have quality childcare opportunities, we have quality education that happens, within a 5-block radius of folks, that can be a game changer if we can do that across the city. Being able to teach children remotely, regardless of what's going on, can make a big difference. But then it also goes into what are the facilities that are available in people's homes, the infrastructure for high-speed internet, what happens, do we need to create hotspots, what are the tools that are available. But I think those are all conversations that if we're going to get different communities into this informational economy and have them being able to perform anyway, that's what's needed anyway. So the positive externalities, the knockoff effects are vast and many if we take care of this one issue. So just really thankful that you are in this conversation with us. Citizens Committee is not finishing with this conversation. We're going to have at least a part 2 of it as we go into January and February, because I believe as rates go up and folks have to quarantine, making sure that folks have access to education, information, and childcare is something that we want to make sure that we have a space for that conversation. So I just want to thank both of you for being with us and want to give you both a final word. Dr. Rebecca Garte, can you give us a few words, and then Joshua, and then we'll officially close.
Yeah, just add on to what you said about quality. We are with early childhood education primarily, as well as some elementary, but in the early childhood space, we're talking birth through 8 years old. And so whatever does happen, making sure that it is developmentally appropriate, that children are using their hands and their bodies to learn, not just, staring at a screen, and helping families see that and work with that, I think could be another really important piece that this could potentially have. So I'm very excited, and I can't wait to connect with some of the grant partners that we've already connected with and get some logistics going.
All right, Joshua?
Yeah, again, just thank you so much for allowing Siegel Family Endowment to be a part of this conversation and to share the great work that Ben is doing at Crayola College Prep. And I think for us, regardless if it's learning pods, if it's in-person learning or remote learning, I think it's all of our responsibility to make sure excellent, high quality, equitable learning is possible and happening. And so really excited to just stay connected and partner to make that the reality, and continue this conversation moving forward to make sure that students and families are truly benefiting from the best that's out there.
And that's a great way to end. We are making the commitment. This conversation is not over. We definitely have our Citizens Committee mailing list. So we have our newsletter that comes out. We'll have information and resources on this topic. On all of our social media channels, look out for opportunities to engage this topic. There's a QR code. You can point your camera there and it will take you to where you need to go so that you can get access to our resources, the magic of the internet. We're just really proud to be able to stand up for New York City in this moment. We all should work together. We are all in for NYC, and we count it a privilege to be in this with you. Have a very safe and festive and hopefully reflective and centered holiday season. I hope you and yours stay well. Be on the lookout for more opportunities and forums that we have. And we will have our grant application open for another rounds of grants in the early 2021. So be on the lookout for opportunities to also get access to those resources. Thank you so very much. Thank you to all of our participants, and have a great day and stay safe out there in the snow. Thanks so much.